bubble and also actually be here. So let me just, we titled this talk basically Turkey after Erdogan, question mark at the end, basically as a speculative piece as to what may eventually await the country. Not because I anticipate necessarily that he will be out of power anytime soon, although he has been in power for the last almost 20 years, or certainly his party has, right? But one way or another, time will take its course and Erdogan will depart from government one way or another. I mean, it's only a matter of time. So it's not necessarily that speculative. I don't claim to have any information as to when that will occur. But there are some serious question marks, I think, that's worth asking in terms of what essentially we should be braced for, or some of the, what we should be anticipate, and what should the country do. And I've been working on this piece, a longer sort of writing piece for a think tank I'm affiliated with in Washington. So it's now in the editorial process. Actually, it's been in the editorial process more than I like. They keep on coming back with more questions and more revisions, and it's becoming quite vexing at this point. But anyway, this allows me to sort of hopefully give them the videos of this and just nudge them and say, come on, let's get it out the barn gate. It's enough with this. But so why look at this? Well, it's important to ask the question simply because this is the third time that President Erdogan is actually putting in a bid for the presidency, right? He was first elected in 2014. But unlike any other time, his vie for power, would be a prime minister or president since 2003 when he occupied the position, I think most of us would agree that this is the most politically perilous time for him, simply because I think he is likely at his political weakest that we have ever seen him. And certainly the country is at its economic weakest. And all that is a way of saying that if you think he had a weak spot in his ability to get re-elected, this might be it. And why do we think that? As one person once said in reference to American politics, it's the economy stupid. I mean, again, I was on the tube the other day coming up from the airport into central London. I saw somebody's newspaper, with massive bold print suggesting that inflation in the United Kingdom had hit 11%, which is no small nothing to be trifled with. But in Turkey, I'm not sure if you know this, the official rate of inflation, the official, is 85% per year, and actual consumer inflation is thought to be running by a group of a non-government affiliated association of economists in Turkey suggests that it's actually running closer to 150 to 160% per annum. So just that figure alone shows that there is a considerable brewing resentment, anger with price increases, and the middle class essentially melting in front of the government's eyes. But also on top of that, what we have seen is the devaluation and the erosion of the currency against hard currencies such as the euro and the dollar by as much as 60% in just the last 16 to 18 months. It's quite staggering how badly the economy has floundered. And on top of that, the Turkish society is extremely polarized. They either love or either hate Erdogan. And this is not unique to Turkey, but essentially we are seeing this across the board, people saying that it might be time for a change because this government is not positioned or does not have sufficient interest or the willpower to essentially set the country back onto an even political and economic keel. Also, tangentially, I don't think this really impacts voters' concerns or whatever, but also it impacts them in a sort of tangential, indirect way, which is Turkey's reputation on the international stage. I mean, it really has become quite a marginalized, isolated, and distrusted country with its traditional partners, allies, as well as institutions. If you've been following the recent spat, for example, with the proposed accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO, well, Turkey at this point is the only country that is holding up that membership, and it's likely to continue to do so until at least possibly the elections have passed, because that is something Erdogan is beating up and down, saying, we have concerns that we need to address, but it's essentially a bullying tactic that makes him look stronger at home. Turkey has also recently, since 2019, acquired Russian missile defense technology to the chagrin of NATO, the United States, and all of its partners, simply because it exposes the alliance to a considerable amount of collecting on part of Russian military and intelligence capabilities, which Turkey seems to be relatively unapologetic towards. But also, I mean, Turkey continues to host terrorist entities on its soil, such as Hamas, and it refuses to recognize Hamas as a terrorist organization, which is a non-starter. And all of these help compound the image that essentially worsens the country and its image in the face of its international partners and allies, which then feeds back into this sort of negative economic prospect, which then motivates voters to think maybe it's time for a change. What has it done to Erdogan? Well, I mean, yes, he still seems invincible, right? I'll be the first person to take my hat off if you follow Erdogan's political career. He should not be underestimated. Yes, he is weakened, but he is what I have often referred to as an election machine. I mean, this is where he thrives the most. You put him up against an election time clock, right, and put any opposition in front of him. This guy has been extremely successful in prevailing, no matter what odds are being put in front of him. So don't underestimate him. But his reputational credibility right now has taken quite a hit. And on top of that, the system of government that he does preside over, the Turkish presidential system, which came into force as of 2017, which did away with the country's parliamentary system, right, is essentially failing. By concentrating all the powers of the executive into the hands of the presidency, you've got this notion of the presidency micromanaging and centralizing and trying to govern all aspects of Turkish life. Turkey's economy is greater than 6 to 8 European Union countries put together. One man cannot govern that country. It's just, it is not designed to weather this. And so what you're finding is the economic problems that are highlighted in inflation and currency crisis are compounded by this sort of notion of ungovernability. The institutions are not ruling. They're not finding answers. The presidency is not delegating. It's instead trying to control everything and micromanage at the same time. There is a huge issue of a lack of rule of law in the country. I mean, the judicial system is basically on its knees. And this is not just me saying so. I mean, any sort of report you read, whether it's the OSCE, or Freedom House, or numerous sort of non-governmental publications seem to suggest that law contracts, if they're on the wrong side of the government or they've angered the presidency, etc., no one thinks this is a safe haven for capital inflows, or if anything, it's only hot money portfolios that seem to be flowing in and out of Turkey relatively quickly. But what makes it even more perilous for Erdogan is something that he designed by himself. The Turkish-style presidential system, for you to be re-elected as president or elected as president at any given time, you have to achieve 50% of the vote plus one vote. This really sets him up quite negatively to succeed there. Previously, when he did seem more sort of successful and capable and sort of motivating voters, right, that wasn't so much a problem. But right now, any sort of polls, and I'm not the greatest truster of Turkish polls, regardless of how credible some of them can seem to be, despite that, you're looking at Erdogan's approval ratings of somewhere between 30 to 35%, although, as I've seen it in the recent past, that seems to be creeping up slightly more. But anyway, just by design, he seems to be up in an uphill battle simply because how do you secure 50% of the vote plus one? It doesn't, we're not altogether essentially clear on that. So that's what he's up against. That's the sort of essential background. So who stands to challenge him, right? What is he up against? So he's up against something called the Nation Alliance, which is every party in the Turkish parliament, apart from his governing Justice and Development Party, the AKP, as well as his sort of unofficial ally and backer, the MHP, the nationalists, right? They formed an alliance of 6 parties called the Nation Alliance because they figure that essentially that these 6 parties will nominate a unified candidate that they can stand behind for the presidency and essentially successfully challenge Erdogan to take over the and defeat him once and for all. Strength in numbers sort of philosophy goes. More about the characters in a couple of minutes, but what I would say is, well, what I would ask is, well, what do we make of this alliance? Does it stand a good chance of actually challenging Erdogan? Well, the problem right now is we know very little about what they stand for, right? Their assumption has been, since basically coming together and unifying under this umbrella of 6 parties under this alliance, we've assumed that they would come out with a strong program. They would actually nominate a credible candidate, especially one that has sort of charisma and gravitas that voters will essentially, gravitate towards. But we know very little about them, as in, the main opposition Republican People's Party, the CHP, the party of Atatürk, was the one that essentially that put this together. They're the sort of underwriters for this. But But the only thing they're really committed to saying is once they assume power, and that's the fundamental weakness of our outline, they assume that because of this sort of grim backdrop I outlined, that they will just essentially vote for the alliance no matter what. Their biggest promise is we are going to transition Turkey back to a parliamentary democracy. That's all we know. We also know something about them saying we're going to also reinstitute the rule of law and also mend ties with Turkey's former and traditional anchor partner and partners and allies, presumably NATO, the United States, and the European Union. Okay. The problem is that's it. And given that the elections have to take place sometime prior to June 2023, I'm estimating, my guess is somewhere in the spring, just before that, that it's going to essentially happen. You might think that they might actually outline an opposition government program. What do they stand for? Because my biggest criticism of the Nation Alliance is it's all very well and true in terms of like saying, this is why we should defeat Erdogan. He's a basic plague in all our houses. He's done this, he's done that, sure. But what do you stand for? What is it that you are giving voters? And right now, that doesn't seem to be a whole lot. And my fear is going forward, if they don't give them a solid electoral platform to stand behind in terms of policies, programs, and candidates that they can recognize, the problem then becomes, right, Mr. Erdogan himself is possibly the devil that people know that they can possibly gravitate towards simply because he's in charge. He's a known entity, right? And right now, he has been very successful to start the sort of monetary taps being turned on. Government spending is going up. Pensions are going to get boosts. Interest rates are being continued to be lowered. Cheap credit has been rolled out at 2.5%, which is ridiculous, allowing businesses to borrow. Well, my biggest beef with the opposition that calls out Erdogan for doing all this jingoistic stuff, and yes, it matters. But when I say this, it kind of ruffles feathers at home, and I was like, it's totally legitimate. That's what governments do before an election if they're up against the wall. They spend. It's not illegal. It's not prudent, but that's what governments do. My comment to the opposition alliance is, what do you have to say? What is your alternative? What are you saying to voters? And it's not much. Yeah. On top of that, the one thing we do know that they are not doing is they don't look like they're ready to take over government. And if there's people in this room who are old enough to remember this, I'm just about old. Well, I was in first year PhD in the SOAS program. I remember this. I was with my advisor, Bill Hale. We were literally at the BBC on the night of the election. We got the best sort of money paid to us as grad students to oversee and help with the electoral numbers being coming out. I was so excited. I was 24 at the time. What happened there is even before that night when Erdogan took power, or the AKP took power, I should say, the year before it, certainly for the year before it, the programs that the AKP rolled out, the publications they put out, the platforms, for example, the emergency action plan of 100 points that they put out to voters saying, here's our #1 priorities when we come to power. And they literally started ticking off this as they took over power. But they put out the message, they made themselves known, they traveled to halls of power in Europe, they visited Washington, they made themselves known. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu was in Washington a couple of weeks ago, and I think the best thing he did, no, don't get me wrong, because I'm a part of this crowd, he went and visited a bunch of, universities. He met with no government officials, nothing. He also came to London, I hear, and just basically puttered about meeting students, I believe. There doesn't seem to be any air of presidency as to them ready to assume this, the levels of power, which is unfortunately working against them. Working against them. So the other big factor is who's going to be the presidential nominee. Again, at this stage, we don't know who it is. We're assuming, or I'm assuming, there were more front runners, but I think it's kind of been whittled down to 2. The most visible sign you see is the leader of the main opposition party, the CHP's chairman, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. And on the other hand, right next to him, and the base is really pushing this more and more, is the mayor of Istanbul, Mr. Ekrem İmamoğlu. And the difference between these 2 candidates, I would argue, is kind of night and day. And I don't necessarily have a pull in this game. I don't really have a preferred candidate one wherever, but just looking at it in terms of who they're facing off against. Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu is 75. he's been chairman of the CHP since 2010. Very personable, very decent, very honest person. He's done what I think is a reasonably good job of managing the CHP, a party which is extremely factionally ridden, prone to being pulled in different ways by different sort of, wings of the party over time. But the problem is he's relatively uncharismatic, doesn't seem to be really connecting with voters, doesn't really, just continuously putting out sort of the wrong message. And a classic example of that was an own goal they scored a couple of weeks ago, whereby they essentially said, Kılıçdaroğlu went on the offensive saying, if you vote for the CHP, we will enshrine guarantees for the headscarf ban in Turkey, as in we will make sure that it's legally established that women can wear whatever they want. Couldn't have thought of a worse strategy, because Erdogan then immediately jumped on that and said, okay, well, let's have a constitution. Let's have constitutional changes to enshrine those guarantees into the constitution. Are you with me? And then we had 3 days of television debate where Kılıçdaroğlu was roasted, saying he's not willing to change the constitution for it. And Erdogan basically went on the offensive, saying, well, you're not sincere. But you can sort of see how this sort of turned into a complete debacle. So why talk about the headscarf when number one, people's biggest issue right now is, how am I going to pay the rent? How am I going to keep the lights on? There's no, the price of natural gas in Turkey is astronomically high. How out of touch do you need to be? So we're assuming, and the base pressure in the CHP is really ratcheting up, suggesting that Kılıçdaroğlu is out of touch, and instead they should gravitate towards this sort of younger, more charismatic, and better campaigner than Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, who is this Mr. İmamoğlu. I'll say two things about him in terms of why I think he might stand a better chance. The best chance he has as to why he should be the presidential nominee is because Erdogan's afraid of him. Right? And he should be afraid of him. In 2019, when Turkey held its municipal elections, when the AKP lost the majority of Turkey's biggest cities, Istanbul was the highlight. It really is the biggest sort of non-government seat that you can run against. And it's also what made Erdogan, being mayor of Istanbul. İmamoğlu won the Istanbul race, fair and square. Erdogan was so upset at this, he annulled the Istanbul result and forced a re-election, ran the Istanbul elections once again. 3 months later, İmamoğlu not only won again, but his margin of victory was actually greater. And he now sits as the mayor. So he defied Erdogan very forcefully at the ballot box. Two, just this summer gone, İmamoğlu, just to sort of flex his sea legs, just to sort of see what he'd be like as a national campaign person, he essentially carried out a tour of Turkey's Black Sea region. And people thought, well, that's nice. Well, who cares? Well, Erdogan cares. Because when he visited the port town Rize, Rize is Erdogan's hometown. I mean, for İmamoğlu, a politician who's only a mayor right now, albeit an important one, to actually sort of really campaign in Erdogan's home turf, a year before the election, even before he is the presidential nominee, is quite sort of defying of Erdogan. And
that's home turf as well, though.
It is, but I mean, you're the mayor of Istanbul, so I just thought it was very, very, very brave of him, right? And so, and he was received very well. That's the interest. I mean, the way he essentially works the crowd is very, very successful. But he also, just being on point and on message, if you follow his social media sort of stuff, he's quite on point. And the last thing I'll say about his candidacy is to suggest that, again, I don't trust polls at all, but it looks like, and I'll just leave it at this, saying, if you follow the more 2 or 3 credible polling outlets, it seems to suggest that Mr. İmamoğlu not only wins against Erdogan outright in the first round of voting, i.e. you can get 50% of the vote in the first round against Erdogan, but if it was to go off to a second round, that he would decisively defeat Erdogan much with a greater margin. So we don't know. We'll see. So finally, and before I shut up and I'll get my colleagues and yourselves to grill me, what is the incumbent's response? What are we expecting from Erdogan? Sort of, is he just going to sit there and sort of let the vote happen, and if he loses, disappear? I don't know. I will say this. Yes, our assumption, our go-to is that I'm a little pessimistic, but Turkey is a country which has traditionally high turnout and people want their vote respected. So we'll see what happens. But first point I would make about this is, look, under any sort of normal circumstance, be it Turkey, the United Kingdom, the United States, etc., an incumbent enjoys a great amount of incumbency advantage. visibility, reputational recognition, control of government resources. You know, it's unparalleled. It really is an unfair starting point for anybody. And Erdogan has views of that. So that's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. And he uses that to the maximum effect, and he will do so. And again, that's legitimate. People harken on about saying this is not fair. It's fair. Again, I've already mentioned this. He's already started to turn on the monetary taps. Spending is up, and it's going to continue to go up. So there will be a sugar high in the Turkish economy. Just yesterday, we found out that the Saudis are essentially going to park approximately region of $5 billion in Turkish banks. But it's not a lot of money as far as Turkey is concerned. But hey, you can spend that to prop up the lira. You can spend it to prop up pensions. Whatever you can do. I mean, central bank has starved the funds. He's also transitioning or transferring contract civil servants into permanent civil servants into the bureaucracy. What else is he doing? Continuing to lower interest rates so manufacturing goes up and all this sort of stuff. People say this is, you know, he's just abusing the economy. Well, yes, he is. But again, it's not illegal. It's what governments do. But on the slightly more sinister side and stuff to expect my biggest concern if Imamoglu is nominated as the candidate, and there's been some sort of back and forwards in terms of criticism saying why isn't the alliance nominating him sooner rather than later? The only credible explanation I can give is Mr. Imamoglu, as mayor of Istanbul, has a number of lawsuits pending against him which are completely trumped up, and they're motivated by the AKP as far as we can tell, for things like slandering something or another, etc. Essentially the same sort of obstacles that Erdogan faced when he had a political ban on him. But those accusations and that lawsuit has been put on ice. The prosecutors have asked for him being banned from politics and removed from public office. The assumption is if they name a candidate tomorrow, then that lawsuit could proceed and they could actually ban him. If they wait until the electoral election date has been declared and then Imamoglu becomes the nominee, it's not impossible, but it looks really shady if you then bang up the main opposition candidates, right, in prison. It just becomes that hard. That's the only credible explanation I can have for why they're not naming him or anyone else for that matter, because they want to keep their cards hidden. The other big thing in Erdogan's favor, and this is in the realm of the illegal, is the supreme body which governs Turkey's elections, and the final arbiter and the nominator of who's the winner and who's the who wins essentially, is the High Election Council, or the YSK by the Turkish acronym. That is, like most other Turkish government institutions, staffed 100% with Erdogan loyalists. They've made a point of doing this, right? So whoever is declared the winner is going to be declared by that, and they're the final arbiter. And this is where I sort of split with my pessimist friends, and I am one of the most pessimist people in this sort of realm, whether Erdogan departs peacefully or not, is this notion of voter intimidation, ballot box tinkering. So people think this is a very sort of opaque, secretive, very clandestine sort of thing that Erdogan and the AKP do to sort of manipulate results. And I don't think it could be further from the truth, right? The only way that Erdogan or the AKP essentially is able to manipulate the vote, if they can, is with people who are charged with monitoring ballot boxes in precincts, deserting those boxes because they think the election is over and they don't need to stick around anymore. Why would they do that? Well, if you look at the last election, basically Erdogan went on the airwaves and said, I've won. That was before a lot of key election, ballot precincts had done with the process of counting votes. But if you dishearten just enough people, the guy goes on TV saying, I'm won, thank you very much for turning out, the next 3 years are going to be great. If the opposition presidential candidate doesn't actually challenge him and say, just shuts up and just lets the whole thing carry on going, right? And then the problem is that people, every precinct, every ballot box has tabulated results on paper. If the monitors, everybody, election monitors from each party representative, international observers, whatever, are there, if they don't stick around to certify that ballot, that piece of paper, that then gets fed into the computer, which then gets transmitted to the YSK in Ankara, the High Election Council, then you can write anything you want on this. This is why I say this is not magic. This is not opaque. This is not some really clever sort of Putin-esque type malfeasance. All this is people deserting their posts. Stay the course. This is why I say it's really hard for these guys to manipulate the results. That's why they can get away with, if they must, manipulating where they can the deserted precincts. You know, half a percentage point, maybe a percentage point in the overall tabulation result. But overall, if this is the tabulated result that people have, they've taken a photograph of this, and this is what's transmitted to Ankara, these two have to match, right? It's that simple. And this is why I'm trying to say to observers or colleagues and friends that this is the crux of how our, you know, elections happen in Turkey. They can't. It's not like 90% of the result magically ends up going for Putin overnight. Nobody knows how. It's, you know, this is the strength of the Turkish system and why it chooses to prevail. So much more to say about that, but I'll shut up here and hopefully that's enough to get us to missions.
Thank you, Sinan. I think I'm with you. Those type of regimes, as we know, it's much more important what happens in the run-up to the election, but not on the election day. So the day to rescue in the campaign and fairness rather than the elections in the state. But let's now hand over to Bill Parks. Some comments and questions to kick us off.
Thank you. As Sinan said, we already offered this performance in the Centre for Turkish Studies in London. So we've kind of rehearsed it in a kind of way.
Is it going to be the same question?
And one problem I've got is exactly that. I don't want to ask Sinan the same question I asked them, because that'd be too easy for him. So I'm trying to think of something difficult to say. Secondly, I don't much like fiction anyway, so I find this topic quite difficult for me intellectually. I don't do for fiction easily. Thirdly, I agree with a lot of what Sinan says, so I'm trying to find a bit of space here to be a kind of discussant. To do that, I think I've got two observations which might seem a little bit abstract, but nevertheless they're appealing to me, and then a question that is a bit more substantive. The first observation is really about electoral systems. Sometimes it seems to me, and I'm thinking here as much about the British system as I am the Turkish system or indeed any system, sometimes the system shapes the way we offer narratives about the system. So if I give you an example, we in the UK talk about the Labour landslide of 1945. They didn't get 50% of the vote. Actually, nobody in the UK ever gets 50% of the vote to form really large government majority. So the Johnson's Conservative government under Johnson got 43% of the vote and an 80-odd seat majority. If you look at Erdogan's shaping in the polls, he gets 30 to 40%. Actually, in some electoral systems, that doesn't look bad. You can go quite a long way with that. So I think that's the sort of observation we need to make about the way the system works. Whether this is more difficult for presidential system, I think it is. But then I get to have an abstract observation about governance in general. You have lots of presidential systems and monarchical systems, and you can find failings that you can trace back to those systems, but the systems stay alive. They keep going. If you compare with, say, so if you look at Turkey now, I mean, it has an economic growth rate. Its indebtedness measured against GNP quite a bit less than the UK's. And there's a lot of people in Turkey whose lives have benefited enormously under the AKP. They have schools now, hospitals and clinics and railway stations and airports outside their provincial towns and so on. And in a polarized society, this can matter quite a lot. So I just have this, I want to be a little bit careful about negativity about Erdogan, because to some extent, it's because of the system, funnily enough, that he has devised that makes things look difficult for him. But as against some other political systems, he's not doing that badly, both in the economic sphere and the political sphere. So I want to just sort of raise a warning about allowing the system to shape our narrative. My second observation stems a little bit from Sinan's comment about the AKP election victory in 2002. I mean, first of all, they only got 30% of the vote and became a single party government. I mean, that just didn't happen in Turkey, but it did happen with 30% of the vote because of the rule, have a 10% rule, which rules out parties don't get 10%. So 30% gave you a majority. And it's true, they had a quite detailed program and have done a lot of homework. But I would say the real reason why they won in 2002 is because all the previous parties, the traditional parties, had discredited themselves because they had just induced an economic collapse in Turkey or presided over an economic collapse in Turkey. In a way, the AKP only had to be there and say nothing to do with us. We weren't in power. All those guys were. So I do wonder whether you can translate what happened in 2002 to now. And first of all, a problem for the opposition parties is there isn't yet an actual collapse in which the IMF has had to step in, which was the case in Turkey in 2002. The AKP could benefit from that. So I think they've got that real problem. And I wonder whether their calculation, may be thinking a little bit here of Keir Starmer, but I wonder if their calculation might be, we don't want a detailed program. The best we can do is just make ourselves look a bit different from Britain. And maybe that's the best we can do. Coming up with detailed programs gets you into a kind of awkward area about the details. And maybe just to say, we are not Erdogan, might be an electoral tactic, as well as I think stemming from all the problems within that coalition. Out of that observation about what is it best for the opposition to do, how do oppositions win in Turkey, there's a question, and it's to do with Imamoglu, and Sinan will recognize this question. When Imamoglu won the Istanbul election, he appealed to the Kurdish vote and got quite a lot of the Kurdish vote. Now, to some extent, the HDP, the Kurdish party in Turkey, isn't a part of this opposition coalition. Some people have described them as kingmakers. I think that endows them with a little bit too much electoral capacity, but they do have a lot of electoral capacity. And it might well be that if his Istanbul behavior is anything to go to, Imamoglu, if he becomes the chosen candidate for the opposition, might try to widen the franchise, widen the vote, and appeal to Kurdish voters. In that coalition is also people like Meral Akşener of the EU party, who is very nationalistic and quite hostile to dealing with the HDP or with any softening of any position on the Kurdish situation in Turkey. So I wonder if not only a reason why the opposition hasn't chosen a candidate, but the problem for them would be if they chose Imamoglu as their candidate, is that the opposition then splits. Imamoglu might be more likely to be Erdogan, but he also might be quite likely to fragment that opposition to Erdogan. So that's my sort of question. Is Imamoglu necessarily the best choice for the opposition, even though he is, you are right, in the opinion surveys, the guy most likely to give Erdogan a tough fight? That's my question.
Great. Let's collect a few more questions from the audience before we pass it back to Sinan. Any reactions? If you could introduce yourself as well.
Yeah, hello. I'm Muhammed Assaner from Turkey. I studied. So what I would say is that while talking about the opposition and their policies, you mentioned like they don't have a program, so they don't actually say anything to people and so on. But like again, from Turkey, I'm kind of interested in Turkish politics, but I've never read any party programs ever in my life. Actually, no one reads them, so no one actually decides in accordance with programs or like specific policies or so on. So Erdogan has not been winning the elections with like specific policies. Like he was just telling some dreams, like 2023 vision. It doesn't have to be real or it doesn't have to be realistic, but like he makes people following him a part of a bigger project that they feel that they are part of something bigger than the party or bigger than their like surrounding. So it's like, so what I would say is that like the way you describe how an opposition can be successful is a very like top-down project where some people are just laying out some projects, some policies, some programs, and then people will be like, okay, you see these guys are gonna make Turkey a better place, so they will just vote. I don't think this is the case. I think what they need to do is to find a strong leader who can sell some dreams to people, so people will feel like, okay, this is the guy who will be, or woman who will be representing us, like, and make Turkey great as it was once. So I think these sort of things, like feelings, rather than real policies, like feelings, emotions seem to be more important right now in Turkish politics.
Or if I can rephrase what you say, it's about the narrative. So the narrative can have the emotional side, but also might have some substantive policy side. But it's not necessarily a dry manifesto. I mean, a manifesto will be just a statement that the party and the JHP are on the same page.
Like for instance, in terms of policy, what Erdogan says right now for the next 4 or 5 years, actually nothing. He just sells some dreams. This will be Turkey's era. So it's very abstract, but it still seems to be working. Right?
There was another question at the back. I see someone. Okay, David.
Thank you, Dima. David Madden, some activist. How does Erdogan respond when confronted with questions about his running of the economy? Because by any standards, this is a very high inflation rate. It's been a high inflation rate for many years, and he can't disown it. So how do you respond?
Okay, let's do those questions now. Bill put forward the anti-Erdogan, but also HDP and the Kurdish issue, and those two questions.
Yes. Well, you already did pull the rabbit out of the hat. It's a difficult question. So my answer would be, I think just again from the data point of view, Imamoglu is probably the right candidate for defeating Erdogan, but it's not necessarily the right candidate as far as members of the alliance want, because you're right, it's going to cause ruffle some feathers. But I think we were having this discussion before, and I'd be interested to get Dimo's input into this, simply because I think he might be the good consensus candidate, because if it was someone like Mansur Yavaş, that's a non-starter for the Kurds, absolutely not. And I think Akşener is cognizant of this. I think they all kind of know that Imam Kılıçdaroğlu is not going to, excite anybody enough even to vote for him, even whilst holding their noses, because it's going to seem like a fiasco of CHP candidates in previous presidential elections, like İhsanoğlu or İnce, which is a debacle. So I suspect İmamoğlu is the right candidate, but how do they make that work? Because you're right, the Kurds are the key in this. If you think about it, and I think there's some elements of truth to this, 30 to 40% of voters, as far as we can tell, have already made up their mind to re-vote for Erdogan, which leaves another 30 to 40% of voters going to vote for the alliance, one way or another. You're left with a 10 to 20% middle ground that is kind of undecided, and that's where you get the Kurds, right? The HDP, if they were part of the Nation Alliance, they would hold somewhere about, based on polling, 10 to 15% of the national vote, which puts them the second biggest coalition. If they were part of the alliance, that would make them the second biggest partner. Their opinion and who they back as a candidate absolutely matters. They can back İmamoğlu, but I don't think they can back Yavaş. That's a big problem for them. And here's another problem that I didn't go to really delve into this time, which is the alliance firmly refuses to have any sort of talks or include the HDP, the Kurdish party, in the actual electoral alliance, simply because if they do, they're worried about Erdogan labeling the alliance as an entity which loves quote unquote terrorists, right? And that makes me actually somewhat angry, because, well, you are elected members of parliament forming an electoral alliance. If you cannot get together and ally yourselves with the HDP and just shrug off whatever Erdogan throws at you, well, who else is going to do it? That's your job. It's your job to convince voters and just shrug off Erdogan's accusations and slurs and say, we will solve this Kurdish issue. And here's why we need to have these people in the alliance. Which then leads on to your question. I agree. I don't think it should be like nerdy economic policy which people aren't going to. You're right. They're not looking for that, right? But it is actually building off on that message. Turkey's biggest unresolved issue is the Kurdish problem. What do you have to say to Kurdish voters? However you manifest the problem in your head as a society, it is a problem. They're looking for a message. They're looking for a reason to vote for you. You need to be able to essentially convince them, because right now, what Erdogan is putting forward his weakest message. It worked for him in the past, which is, we're going to build this. Look at what we've already built. At this point, in 20 years into a government, if you say, I'm going to build more bridges and tunnels and airports, nobody's going to care. Nobody does care. Simply because they figured out, well, that was nice and glitzy when I had a bit of an income that mattered. But do I really benefit out of the fact that there's a third bridge that's put in the middle of the Bosphorus, or it connects Izmit and the other side of the Dardanelles? Who cares? That doesn't directly benefit me. The more promises he makes for infrastructure, the more it falls on deaf ears. People need to hear something else. And you're right. And this is where I agree with you. Unfortunately, the Turkish system of politicking is very charisma dependent, right? It's not. It's its greatest weakness. Turks demand strong leaders, and therefore you have to have a reason, a persona, a gravitas that attracts voters. And Erdogan had a lot of that. He doesn't anymore. You've seen him on TV; he looks frail. If he's not frail, he's just shouting obscenities at somebody or is demeaning somebody. I mean, it's just not a. He looks weak. So what do you have? And I suspect one of the biggest sort of convergence points of the opposition, not the only one, but the big convergence points, like, what do you say to Kurdish voters? Because if you go back to the 40-40 on one side and 20 in the middle, that's where you're selling message. Kurds need a reason to vote for this, this alliance. And right now, I don't think they've been given one. But you're right. They need to be sold some sort of dream in terms of talk about the economy, in terms of what are you going to do to transform and make people's lives more stable and meaningful, access to jobs. Even if it's just blatant promises of, unresolved promises of how you're going to get Turkey's youth or college youth into positions of jobs. What's the strategy? What's the message? And again, it's not nerdy stuff, but what dreams are you selling in your words? We don't have any of that. And Imamoglu is the closest we've seen because he seems to be able to connect and resonate at the level of the street. You know what I mean? When he's glad handing, people in the market or hugging old women and kissing young children, saying everything's going to be great. Hey, that has currency. He's untried, right? So, and how does Erdogan respond to? That's a really good. It made me chuckle because I'm going to get this wrong. What did he say about it? When he kept on lowering interest rates, which basically the conventional orthodox economists' view, which we are not. We love talking about we're not economists. But every time he's chided by major international creditors, the finance world, I don't know, the World Bank, who knows?
The interest rate lobby.
He calls them the interest rate lobby, just accuses them of this, saying they're going. But he said interest. What's the interest? Interest is a reason. What's? Can somebody help me with this? He said.
So he believes that interest rates, if you raise interest rates, also inflation goes up.
Right.
Which is just the opposite, obviously.
That's exactly it. That's how he responds. And people just look at, tilt their head and say, what? No, that's not how it works. And then he goes, I'm going to prove you wrong. And his finance minister is basically on record saying the world is about to experience a shattering in economic orthodoxy, and we will prevail and be proven right. And I laugh at it too, and I snigger and whatever, but I think you are literally watching an entire country implode, drag down. And unfortunately, people, if I don't, I have a reason, I'm a relatively educated person, I don't necessarily understand monetary policy, but most people just hear this in Turkey and think, well, okay, he's the president, sure, so he must know something. But then he'll just target people and delegitimize them and demean them for calling him out. And basically, any serious economist or industrial group or business entity does not want to take Erdogan on face-to-face saying, no, you're wrong, because they'll either have their assets seized or essentially, they will lose favor with creditors and whatnot, and no one's willing to do that.
Let's collect a few questions from the internet. We have online viewers who have asked questions. So first one, this comparison with Hungarian. The person is asking whether Erdogan uses religion, which is self-explanatory, and whether his message resonates differently in different areas, whether it's urban or in a more small town and rural. And there's another question about the impact on foreign policy after the election, or to Turkish foreign policy beyond issues like the disputes in the Aegean and the Mediterranean.
If Erdogan stays in power, or if he leaves?
Well, either way.
Either way.
So there is a question about the immediacy, how Erdogan benefits how much power and sovereignty in the media. And there's another question about what the opposition thinks about foreign policy and specifically relations with the EU. And finally, there's another question on natural gas, whether there's any space for cooperation, irrespective of who wins, or cooperation as in solving the dispute with Greece and others.
Okay.
And this is a diverse set of questions, so it's something
Yes, quite
to package them together.
I'll try and go through them relatively quickly so to give you more time and not drone on. Does he use religion? Absolutely. You know, I don't think, you know, one of the questions that we keep getting asked is Erdogan interested in theocratizing Turkey or just turning it into a full-blown, you know, Islamofascist state at this point? I've literally been asked this. And my sense is always to say absolutely, essentially no. I think he likes utilizing Islamo-nationalist rhetoric to basically fire up an already existing conservative mindset in Turkey towards social issues, which then basically helps him solidify his power base. But that being said, he has visibly sort of, you know, enabled the policy preferences of highly conservative groups inside of Turkey, not least of all sort of tarikats or religious brotherhoods, because they've made calls for, like, you know, in return for continuing their support of Erdogan, they've had policy goals, the most famous of which was removing Turkey from the Istanbul Convention that essentially, you know, guarantee a considerable amount of women's rights in Turkey, which Erdogan was the one championing it, but these religious groups insisted that he walk Turkey out of it simply because that was the condition of their support. So it's all about power dynamics. That's how I would essentially say, does Erdogan use religion?
Can I piggyback on this one and ask you a question about Kılıçdaroğlu? Because I always wondered how much, if he's the candidate, the dog whistle that he's of a religious minority will play. I mean, you don't want to attack him that he's Alevi, but there'll be some sort of propaganda that he's not a real tag because he doesn't belong to the mainstream.
Absolutely, I think that's his main line of delegitimizing attack for Kılıçdaroğlu if he becomes the candidate. I think he would go down. I don't think he. I mean, I think I'm on record for saying Erdogan would feel comfortable sort of selling out his mother if it got him ahead in the electoral prospects by at least 1% or 2 that Michel made. And I don't necessarily mean that in a derogatory sense. I'm just saying, I mean that in the sense of he's extremely competitive. Whatever it takes to stay ahead. If he needs to demean Kılıçdaroğlu for being an Alevi, so be it. It doesn't cost him anything. It doesn't. And people are naturally suspicious of Alevis one way or another in the mainstream. And so, you know, Imamoğlu he can go after legally. Kılıçdaroğlu he can possibly go after within the sense of just his identity. And, you know, Alevis have never, as far as I can see, held bureaucratic or government office ever before, and he's not going to shy away from that. Let's take the media scene. Oh yeah, and that's another advantage that I can touch upon in terms of incumbency. You know, 90% of Turks get their news, so to speak. Sorry, yeah, I think this is the right statistic. The mainstream television is where 90% of media is consumed by the average citizen, right? That's where they get their news. And the airwaves are filled essentially with pro-Erdogan friendly networks. So the availability of freedom of information, you know, is extremely limited. The last presidential election, quite a staggering statistic, I think. The amount of airwaves that the political opposition got, like the CHP, for example, as a percentage of all airtime spent on political candidates, 3% was devoted to opposition candidates in the opposition, whereas 97% went to Erdogan. So,
actually, I mean, that's something that's a colleague recently reminded me of, that the requirement in Turkish legislation to have equal time to opposition and the incumbent was removed in one of those presidential decrees issued.
Oh, he did. So it's now being decreed away. Okay. Well, they've also just passed something else that will impact the media scene, especially social media, which is something called this disinformation law, which passed several weeks ago. This is quite a pernicious sort of law. Basically, it empowers the government and prosecutors to do a number of things. Specifically, they can remove any piece of content. They can order a news outlet or a social media platform to remove any content. It encourages self-censorship because people get more worried about posting or sharing stuff because it now has penalties if it's deemed to be disinformation or divisive or insightful of hatred, etc., etc. And the other thing, literally, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, you name it, WhatsApp, all these platforms, the government can mandate them to remove any content. And you think that they wouldn't cooperate? They do, very forcefully, not because there's huge penalties, although that's a good motivator too, but because the Turkish market for all these social media platforms is extremely lucrative. They do not want to lose out on advertising space, and they are willing to cooperate and have demonstrated that they're willing to cooperate with the government. So the media scene is particularly set against the opposition, simply because it's not a fair playing field. On the notion of foreign policy, whether what happens either way, and there was another question about what's the opposition sort of alternatives to what's going on. Honestly, that's we were talking about this prior to getting together. To me, I mean, Bill, if you have any insight that perspective, I don't feel very strong, necessarily see what if Erdogan wins tomorrow, none of Turkey's problems today that exist today go away. Turkey has a disastrous relationship with NATO. For example, if you think that they just approve the Swedish and Finnish membership tomorrow, well, great, they'll all be happy. But the reputational damage that's occurred to Turkey, I mean, the Finns especially, are so upset with Turkey, simply because prior to them applying for membership, they specifically had a conversation with Erdogan saying, look, we're thinking of applying for this. Is it okay? Do you have any sort of comments or refute? They were assured 100% that Turkey would support them, etc., etc. They feel absolutely cheated. And most of NATO feels this way. And that reputation is going to take a long time to repair. There's just not a lot of goodwill inside of NATO for Turkey. The United States, one of Turkey's strongest sort of partners internationally, historically, and Erdogan continues to sort of bash the US for saying, you're helping the PYD, YPG, you're helping terrorists, etc. And I always say the same thing. The United States gave you Öcalan. And you never, and this is the one thing I keep on telling policymakers in Washington, especially the government. Hit him in his face with this. Gave you Öcalan back in 1999. You should be grateful for that, right? And there is no one in the Department of Defense, or very few, I should say, or certainly nobody in Congress right now that is willing to sort of go to bat for Turkey. None of this changes if Erdogan gets reelected. If the opposition gets into power, I don't know. My guess is, and again, it's where I refer to you, or you, it's not that hard for an opposition. If Imamoglu became the president, for example, all you have to stop doing is just all of this counterproductive stuff. So, for example, stop threatening war with Greece and Cyprus over the Mediterranean. It's just not that hard, right? Now, I actually believe that Turkey has a point. I really do think Turkey has a point over territorial waters and exclusive economic zones in the Mediterranean. I do not think that UNCLOS is applicable in the Eastern Mediterranean as it stands. I think you can litigate this. I'm not sure if Turkey can win it, but it can certainly put a persuasive legal case forward and argue the merits of that in a responsible way. Not recognizing the island of Crete and saying this is my exclusive economic zone and therefore I have drilling rights here. And if you don't respect that, I'm going to send a navy in. Well, then you're going to have a problem because you're going to take on every power in front of you, and it's not how business is done. So all these opposition has to do is essentially walk that back. You can reestablish seemingly good relationship with NATO, but especially the United States, if you dispossess the S-400 missile system. Right? Just get rid of it. Give it to the Ukrainians. I don't know. Put it on eBay. It doesn't really matter. You just can't keep hold of it and continue to threaten to operationalize it. All of these things you can walk back with relative ease to de-escalate tensions and have some basis of rebuilding trust and ties can happen, I believe. And the same with the question for natural gas. I have this pet project that I'm writing right now, and hopefully it will come out in where I hope it comes out, which basically argues the case that the entire linchpin to normalizing Turkey's relationship with the West goes through Cyprus. Right? Solve the my major point would be the only credible entity in the world that can help broker and negotiate a settlement over Cyprus right now is the United States. Neither the UN nor the European Union is going to be in a position to oversee this because it lacks credibility in the eyes of the Turks and the Cypriots. But the US has the governmental and experiential credibility to force this and get both sides to the table. What do you get if you resolve Cyprus? Well, you have the last divided island in Europe resolved. You then have the possibility of Turkey removing objections for Cyprus joining NATO, and for Cyprus then possibly removing objections for Turkey to be included in any European defense initiative that bears fruit. You have the possibility, because the conflict is resolved, territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, and monetization of natural gas becoming a reality, which at this point is risky because you have naval ships in the damn region threatening, adversarial behavior. It's just not, I just don't think, but also it could help, just that negotiation that's broken by the United States can restart a bilateral relationship between US and Turkey, at least give it the framework to get the two powers to work with each other again. But without that, yes, that natural gas gets monetized, but I think it always carries the risk of conflict, which can come at any time.
Bill, do you have any observations? Want to jump in on?
No, I mean, I agree with the thing about Erdogan. It's not only that he's behaves transactionally towards the alliance rather than as an ally. Sometimes he's hostile. Yeah, a lot of the time. And I don't think that Erdogan can undo that damage, even if he softens his line post any election victory that he gets. The thought I sometimes have about Turkey, when you look at the position of the alliance insofar as it has a position, that is the opposition alliance to Erdogan, insofar as it has a position, I think there is a sense in Turkey, not only in Turkey, that it is a multipolar world and Turkey is a more autonomous actor, whoever is in charge, than perhaps once it was able or prepared to be. Some of that might survive Erdogan. So although I think certainly any alternative candidate, any alternative president to Erdogan or government could repair the damage that has been done with NATO, EU, I don't know that within Turkey necessarily Turkey would want to go as far as the US or the EU would want it to do, because I think it has this idea of itself now as a regional player, part of the multipolar world that isn't so kind of subordinate to Western leadership. That might survive Erdogan in a softer form, but it might survive him. So I think there might be difficulties down there, even if an improvement in the relationship can be foreseen. That's my comment.
All right.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the insight. I'm Carolyn Tunja, and I'm writing my DPhil on religion and gender in Turkey here at Oxford. We talked a lot about the popular support that Erdogan or the opposition movement had. And I was wondering if you have maybe some insights into Erdogan's closer circles and the contestations that are going around there. I was just thinking of ministers coming and going. I was thinking of Davutoglu, especially, who just left Erdogan and kind of his own party, Gelecek Partisi. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on how much power Erdogan actually has within the AK Party and also within his own people.
Carlos, you had a question.
Yeah. From those of us who observe Turkish politics, one of the most striking is the collapse of the rule of law. You mentioned the judiciary, but we have hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs as Gülenists, persecuted, imprisoned. Thousands are fleeing to Europe, then they're pushed back by Greece, and so on and so on. So is this rule of law, I mean, the Kurdish leaders are in prison, Kavala is in prison. I mean, is the rule of law issue a political issue? Does the opposition state that this is a matter of principle, that Turkey is sliding towards a dictatorship, and that Erdogan is an illegitimate president as a result? Because from what you said, it seems to me the opposition is actually quite careful to call him out, and they almost even normalized by treating the Kurds as a issue of nationalism, where in fact it's issue of rule of law. So I wonder how clear in the minds of the opposition is the rule of law issue, the legitimacy of a democratically, institutional arrangement, because I think it is at stake in the next election. If the opposition doesn't want to raise it as a political issue, then we have a problem, because maybe the same practices will continue even if they win.
Adrian.
Thank you. Adrian Chasey, CSOX, ex-International Monetary Fund. So I want to come back to the economics question, even if it's perceived as too nerdy to understand.
Give it.
To me, they have a really big, the opposition has a really big problem with the economy. And my question to whoever will take it is, will there be an economic collapse? And if so, will it be before or after the election? Because when I hear of, them shipping in 5 billion to support the lira, I know it sounds to me like the crisis is quite close, because how many 5 billions can you get to support the lira? And when you can no longer get them, then the collapse starts. Now, if the collapse happens before the election, the likelihood that Erdogan leaves is higher. If the collapse happens after the election and the opposition wins, it's a poison pill for the opposition. They're going to be associated with horrible retrenchment that will make it almost not worse for them to have won the election. So I guess my question is, how do you see this?
So it's one last question.
Oh, sorry.
Get them and then we pass it.
I'm Ezgi at a different diplomatic school for public policy here. And my question is mostly about Syria, given it's one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions Erdogan has made over the past decade, not only for Turkey itself, but for the Kurds, the US, Russia, and everyone else. Where do you see that Turkish foreign policy approach going if the opposition takes control of the government? Will we see continuities or significant changes, especially in areas that pertain to US interests, Russian interests, the Syrian refugee situation?
So we have a huge range of questions again.
So thank you for the economy stuff. Just in relation to your background, because you did say IMF, so I remember about 3 years ago, we had one of these interesting Washington type dinners. I'm affiliated with a think tank there, so I work for them.
You're welcome to say which one it is.
It's the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is right side of things, as in their ideological rights. But in one of these dinners, which is essentially just a sort of steering dinner, where we bring in a lot of outside experts and officials. That dinner was particularly poignant in my mind because we had two officials. One was Brett McGurk, who came and talked about this whole Syria stuff, which was just as soon as after Trump fired it, which was very instructive, and I thought was very, very interesting. But the other person they brought in was an economist from the IMF who worked on Turkey. 3 years ago, when we I can't remember his name, and I don't think I've shared it because I think it essentially be a target. They did ask, we did point blank ask him, what would it take to stabilize the Turkish economy, just with a standby agreement, just to sort of undo all this ravaging of, and his point, he said that their estimates was somewhere between 100 to 150 billion dollars of IMF, which, just to put this into perspective, would be the highest, single biggest standby agreement the IMF has ever engaged in, the closest of which would be Argentina, which would just be behind that, which I think was about 60, 70 billion dollars, right? So you're right. I think what are the risks and when it happens? I honestly don't know, because one of the big criticisms that's put to analysts such as ourselves is, well, you've been saying this since 2010 that it's keeps on going, which is a testament to how resilient just the government, the economy of Turkey has been just to weather a massive meltdown or an instant shock, right? But as far as I can understand, the economists are essentially a warning that it could come even in the form of a massive shock or this continued rapid decline. But from the perspective of the opposition, I forgot to say this to whoever asked the economy question earlier on. Well, in addition to weathering, if they want to inherit such a collapse, the other big problem is, even before then, well, what do you say? What's your message to the electorate? If we come to power, we will negotiate with the IMF. We will raise interest rates. We will do prudent things. People don't understand that. You can't run on that. I mean, 2001 was a bitter pill. This will be the single biggest bitter pill that any country has had to weather with an economic stabilization program. Just to put it into another perspective, and I said this, no government audit or government spending audit has been read out by at the Turkish parliament since 2012. By law, Turkey's government spending was reported to the parliament, and no citizen ever listened to it, but at least investors and monitors and whatever are looking at, like, even if it was slightly cooked, whatever, we still had a pretty good accounting of how the Turkish government spent its money. The biggest problem that the opposition has, because the AKP is being in power for 20 years, is we don't know how the government spent its money. You know, they just came out with this, you know, the central bank reported last couple of weeks ago that in the first 8 months of 2022, $28 billion of unaccounted funds had entered the Turkish central bank. And then finance minister called it a net rounding error. I was like, oh, wait, you know, if it was $1 million here, $1 million there, sure. Even in the DOD's budget in Washington, if you say, you know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, it doesn't really make a difference. But $28 billion, where's that money come from? We don't know. We have no idea how the government...
Because the theory is Putin, of course.
So it's a huge problem, as in, like, nobody knows how stuff works unless you are in power. And that's not typical prior to the AKP. We just don't have that experience. So thank you for asking. And also, the one thing that leads speculators, and an economist at our last talk highlighted this, it's not that so much that Turkey has massive debt that's piling up, especially in the private sector. It's that debt that is accrued, and more borrowing that accrues at riskier and higher interest rate levels that accrues, the payback of those is so short term that they become due, they mature very, very quickly, and it's a hopscotch game. I've got this $5 billion, I need to pay that interest. I've got this, I need another loan. It's just, this is where I think it's going to.
But also, you're indebted in dollars and foreign currency, and your revenues are very often on the domestic market in lira, which is highly depreciated. So it's another parallel to Hungary, maybe. 10 years ago. I mean, on the JHP side, I think one problem might be that, I mean, after all, it has also, at least on paper, a social democratic identity. It's a secularist party, but also kind of opposition to Erdogan. But part of it is also that it's a center-left party. So it will be difficult for them to actually say that, no, we'll be the party of financial fiscal prudence and IMF. And what I see them doing is basically offering all kinds of fiscal perks to the populace, and of course Erdogan is outbidding them. That's what's happening right now. And I think government might, and that's again speculative from my part, the government probably has arrived at the wrong conclusion that they can muddle through. Because they've been through a couple of crises over the past years, inflation, but growth has been decent despite the COVID downturn. And they probably, back in their minds, they think they can just pull it through somehow, which might be kind of false comforts. Its complacency might come to haunt them down the line, but we shall see.
This question of rule of law, thank you for that. I mean, look, I think Turks, myself included, but I live outside of this, you know, especially since the coup attempt of 2016, we've become so numbed and so just, news cycle moves so fast, we just cannot take the magnitude of how far the rule of law has been compromised in Turkey, right? When we ask the simple question of, is Erdogan even a legitimate president? I'll be the first one to say, and this is a long unsettled issue, look, you have a president who arguably should not be president. He doesn't have a university degree. By law, he should not be there. Now, some people will respond to that negatively. He produced a piece of document, whatever. Just that one thing. No one has ever done this in the past before, just to ram the system through such that he gets what he wants. Kavala, people being disappeared, purges, people accused of being Gulenist, and it's gotten so out of hand. So many people have lost their livelihoods that the basic rule of law in the country has never been as bad as it is now. We've largely become numb to this. This is the biggest thing to reinstitutionalize once the country is free of the AKP's rule, right? Because I would be the first one to say that this is basically just a crime syndicate rule in the country at this point. There is no accountability whatsoever. We try to sort of analyze it in the sort of institutional framework, the economic backdrop, you know, what would happen if, you know, this was going to happen. But you're basically looking at a crime syndicate rule in the country. There is no accountability. You cannot hold the government to account. Just the fact that you can't audit the government spending is illegal by current law. They don't feel they have to address that. I mean, you mentioned name, I agree with you. You can make just about any field, but you're looking at a kleptocratic entity that has been in charge of Turkey and brazenly doing it for more than at least a decade with no accountability or repercussions. I don't know how you reinstitutionalize that.
But the opposition hasn't made it a big electoral issue, has
well, they can't. That's the other. Well, they should, because again, you're right. Simply because if they don't do it because they're afraid of
how are they going to do anything different when they go?
Well, they should take Erdogan on, as in, like, you are an elected member of parliament. Yes, you can strip you of immunity, but if you're not going to do it because you're vying to change it now, am I going to do it? Is he going to do it? I mean, it's your job to talk about this sort of stuff.
And also, the opposition has some skeletons in the closet.
Yes.
Think about it, since you brought up immunity, who voted for removing immunity? Yeah, exactly, which also came back at them with Berbero later on.
That's right. Yeah, they voted on removing parliamentary immunity. A lot of parliamentarians, especially the Kurdish ones. I mean, yes, they do have skeletons in the closet too. So it's all topsy turvy at this point. And so it's very, very sinister, and we've largely become numb to it. I for one have this notion that you cannot evaluate and normalize the actions of this government by just commenting on, like, from the perspective of policy. You're looking at a country which is not ruled by the rule, but by brute force. And you will pay consequences, I think, if you take them on that one. And it's just very depressing on that level. Bill, did you want to say something like that?
No, I was just going to say on, how does the opposition react? I think you are looking at, it is quite impressionistic of this. Something more deeply within Turkish culture, but maybe it's not only Turkey. There's a lot of anti-Gülenist sentiment across the spectrum in Turkey. There's a lot of, I'll call it anti-Kurdish sentiment across the spectrum in Turkey. And also a lot of sort of dislike for these intellectual Western, here it would be Islington tofu eating woke people. There's a lot of, so Kabbalah is one of those. And for a lot of sects, I don't care about the fate of Gülenist Kurds. They don't care. And that's not an AKP position, that's across the country. Now, it's a bit impressionistic on my part, but I've been there and talked to people across the spectrum, and I find that. You try to say to any kind of Turk, prove something about the Gülenists. Yeah, but they're this kind of person, they're that person. And this is not an AKP position. So I don't know that the rule of law, and this might be an observation not only about Turkey, on those issues, I don't know the rule of law is that strongly held in the culture. So I don't know that Erdogan is sort of doing anything difficult for Turks in that area.
If they were serious about sort of how the Gulen movement has undermined Turkey, which I'm very much aware and agreeing upon.
Yeah.
Well, if you're a political opposition, bring it, call it out. What was the relationship between ex-minister and this Gulen leader or this organization? Call it out. Expose it. Some critical and investigative journalists have been successful in doing that. Some of them are in parliament now. Ahmet Çik is a good one. He's a very successful investigative journalist who's written books about this. He's been in prison once or twice, and he'll be the first one to say, do not be afraid. What are they going to do to you? They're going to detain you for a few months or whatever, maybe a bit longer, but go expose this. So that would be, again, if it's not the opposition that's willing to do this, who will? On the Syria question, well, that's a good one. Thank you. That's a really tricky one. I don't know. I mean, so Erdogan has had this long lingering notion of wanting to sort of resettle a whole bunch of Syrian refugees that is inside of Turkey into hand-picked locations inside of northern Syria to basically break up the Kurdish sort of zones, so to speak, in Rojava, right? I don't know how you get to do that. You can't tell another sovereign power, this is how I will resettle your former population. Good luck to you on that one. But we should probably come to some sort of realization in Turkey, or as Turks, that the majority of the Syrians that refugees in Turkey will not go back. They will not. And that we should be prepared and actually willing to be okay with that, simply because that's just a fundamental reality. The country is too war-torn. They don't feel safe enough. They don't feel they're going to have enough prospects there. They've had a generation of children being born in Turkey who are nearly 10, 12, 15 years old. They don't know anything else. That's just a reality that Turkey now faces.
Yeah, you made it all the way to Istanbul. You have your kids in school. You have a job in the formal sector, although you might be struggling. I mean, you're not going back.
Yeah,
In a housing complex Turkey built somewhere in the middle of nowhere in northern Syria.
Yeah, you don't want to. Yeah, that's not
Behind a wall, by the way. This Turkey built a wall, so it's all going back to Turkey.
Yeah, but also, I think your question was for the wider policy, sort of in terms of.
If I may, I asked it because there's a recent Carnegie report that came out like last week
Yeah,
or something, where the CHP and EU party representatives did say that like they think that the most likely scenario out of Syria is that there will be some sort of Syrian Kurdish autonomy within Syria, sort of like an Iraqi Kurdish model, which I found super interesting because I've never seen the opposition be like, yeah, that may be the case. THP even said like we may be talking with them if we end up ruling.
So this is again all sort of this, being afraid and timid of Erdogan and what will he do to the label. So again, this is when we be sucked into this whole narrative that's been developed by Erdogan. So I've said since the beginning of the Syrian war, the Syrian Kurds do not present a national security threat to Turkey. I've been pulled through the ringer for this by Turkish nationals saying you're a terrorist level. What terrorist threat is the PYD threat position presented to Turkey? None. They've made no claims on Turkish territory. They've not made one threatening move until possibly the other day when they returned fire, some sort of incursion, right? I've even gone as far as to say that Turkey really doesn't have a national security or a national security interest in Syria since the beginning of the Syrian outbreak. Why would you want to topple Assad? So, no, I don't know. I have no understanding. Why are you afraid of the PYD, YPG, whom you rolled out the red carpet for and interacted with for many times? Plus, here's my crowning sort of argument. You established diplomatic ties with the Iraqi Kurds. You established a consulate there. If you can solve your differences with them, what was there to prevent Mr. Erdogan sitting down with Saddam Hussein and say, hey, look, this is getting out of hand in terms of what's happening in Syria, but we'd really like to sort of work with you to ensure that, going forward, this whole spat that began between the alliance between the PYD and the United States and partnering with the PYD to undermine ISIS, which the Turks beat back at heavily saying, you can't solve terrorism by working with terrorists. Well, they don't have to be terrorists to you because they've never made a move on it, a threatening move on it. You can sit and talk to them like you did with the Iraqi Kurds. You could have resolved this. You could have not even had this thing. But again, just by finding an external enemy has empowered Erdogan domestically, I would argue, in really ratcheting attention and spreading, a malicious narrative that, Syrian Kurds are terrorists that are out to kill you. Well, no, they've killed ISIS. They've significantly degraded them. And the United States knocked on your door several times saying, you want to get rid of ISIS? Well, okay, well, let's do it. And then the Turks maneuvered away from it, decided to do something else. So it really, I don't think there's ever been a serious security issue or a security issue, but we've been so sucked down into this notion of what do we do about Syria? Well, there's not much to do. You can literally sit down with Saddam Hussein tomorrow and have tea and basically resolve any differences you have and possibly get into the game of reconstruction of northern Syria with all your construction firms and whatnot and whatever else.
Yeah, a problem I had with all this, all the way back to 2011, I remember causing a big argument by saying, people opposing Assad, I said, Assad's regime has roots. It isn't going to go away anytime soon. Yeah. People thought you're supporting this awful dictator. Well, I wasn't supporting him, that was just the way I saw it. And at that time, I hadn't seen the extent to which, especially Russia, but also Iran, would also back Assad.
Yeah.
The truth it is, whatever the Turkish opposition says or whatever we think makes sense here, in the end, no one party can resolve the Syrian issue. Mm-hmm. But however it's resolved, whoever's in power in Damascus, and that's likely to be Assad or someone like Assad, someone from that regime, that party, are going to have the biggest say. So even if we think it's acceptable to Turkey that there should be an autonomous Kurdish self-governing zone in Rojava, if it's not acceptable to Damascus, unless Turkey is prepared to go in and enforce it, which it wouldn't against Damascus, it's not going to happen. So I think Syria is now such a complex situation that no one can resolve. But I very much agree with what Sinan said. I don't know why we all had this problem with Assad at the beginning. I mean, I understand he's not a nice person. It's not a nice regime. But, there's loads of not nice regimes. Right. Why did we get that involved against Assad. And it's an interesting question for Turkey because they started off not being against Assad and then very quickly switched in a fairly major way. But we all did, and that never made sense. Assad is still there, the regime is still there. And whatever solution we think we can come up with for Syria, Damascus is going to have a say in it.
Yeah. The opposite is also true because Turkey will have a big say, just to play the devil's advocate.
It'll have a big say in the sense it'll have a big voice around the table, but if Damascus doesn't like what Turkey says, it continues to be a destabilized situation in Syria.
And the other thing, I suppose, just put myself in the shoes of Turkish state for a second. I mean, they've been back channeling to Assad for a long time.
Yeah,
They have, yeah.
It's no public secret that they're talking to one another.
There was a question about people around Erdogan. Yeah.
Robin, you had a question.
There was another question.
Which one was that one?
It was
I wrote it down. Do you mind answering?
Yeah, sure. It was about Erdogan and the people around
Oh,
him.
the associates.
And how much support he has within the occupied.
So I remember you mentioned a couple of that. Babacan and Davutoglu are two individuals who are part of this opposition alliance. Babacan was the former finance minister behind Erdogan's sort of economic miracle in the late 2000s. Davutoglu was a sort of the zero problems with neighbors, foreign policy architects, etc., and then so they're now standing against them, and they're basically they're teetering on the edge of disclosing more about how Erdogan rules and what his complicity in certain sort of nastiness is. For example, after what Erdogan asked for after the coup attempt of 2016, Babacan was on the election stump the other day saying, basically, Erdogan told us to go after everybody, to get in Turkish, the kuru ve the yaş, the wet and dry, just blanket sort of get rid of anybody that may present a threat, because if we don't take a decisive effort, then they'll come after us type of approach. Davutoglu's relatively cryptic, saying if I could tell you a lot of stuff, and if I did, it would be really disastrous. Well, speak. Really? I mean, like, what do you have to be afraid of at this point? My suspicion is Erdogan obviously has a lot of tabs on a lot of his close associates, a lot of unpleasant and sort of implicating information, and there's always been this sort of tale out there that Erdogan has files on, Condomat on a lot of post and former, cabinet ministers or whatever, which is one of the reasons why they're all going to shut up is if they don't, well, they have the option, they could just shut up and be in the shadows and just go about living their life, or they could take a stand against him, and then all this will be revealed and be quite embarrassing, and Erdogan still wins, right? So, that was the sort of, I guess, the motivation behind the sort of, when people were gunning for the Gül alternative to run against Erdogan, right? Or, Abdullah Gül becoming, president again, just that he's not willing to do it. And most of that, I think, is tied to the fact that he doesn't want to essentially really be undermined reputation, but also, have his livelihood put at risk as well as his family's. But the close circle that keeps close to Erdogan now, that enables the Ibrahim Kalins, we know, we think that Ibrahim Kalin is his main spokesman, national security advisor, the jacks of all trade. I heard that he wasn't happy. He wanted to actually put peace out and just said, all right. But he's essentially just been, he's there. Does he have a choice? I don't know. I think he's a very different man than he used to be. Yeah. He's quite maniacal and quite sort of disturbing in what the stuff that he sort of defends. But I don't necessarily know if he has a choice. Everyone has a choice, but I think the stakes for just deserting Erdogan are quite real. He doesn't have too many people around him that continue to sort of, enable him. But I suspect the wider circle of apparatchiks, as well as, big business owners like the Dimitar group, all this sort of stuff, they stay close to Erdogan or continue to sort of be by his side, whether it's through media support or, financial, whatever, because they feel they have something to benefit out of it, right? If the ship sinks, then they don't necessarily get that negatively impacted simply because they've probably made, arrangements so that they, but as far as they keep on benefiting out of the system, it's a very symbiotic sort of system. I rub your back, you rub mine. Because if you want to take a stand against them, though, then you're going to have a problem. I don't think anybody stepped out of line simply because it's very Russian, right?
But if it goes down, there will be a soft target. So if there is anybody in the judiciary to show their mettle, they might not go after Erdogan. They might target somebody further down the food chain, and those businesses are likely victim. There's quite a bit in the closest, I'm sure. One last question by Robin before we wrap up, because we are over time already, which also kind of testifies to the quality of the discussion.
Hey, thank you, Dimo. I'll be quick. My observation is when the economy is the, as I would characterize Turkey, in particular when there have been very public disputes between government and government. Most of that recently in the UK. Normally you expect, lots of examples in history, you expect economic collapse to bring about political change. Turkey, as you said, seems to be different. The question is, perhaps a good concluding one, do you think that it's Turkey that's different, or are we seeing a new sort of international order where, with the rise of strong regimes, Hungary coming along fast, that old link between economics and politics has gone?
Oh, it's a big specific question. Bill, would you want to jump in before we ask to Sinan?
No, it's a question I think about quite a lot, I have to say. I mean, we had this discussion before. In fact, both before we met here and last week in London. I sometimes ask myself the question, you know, when we're looking at a major economy on the verge of collapse, what do we mean by that? I mean, Turkey sort of collapsed in 2001. I'm not saying it was as bad then as it is today, but it was pretty bad. I remember, I'm old enough to remember the UK being under direction of the IMF. Yeah, that might happen again as well. So I think you have two things going on. One is the system works to stop the complete collapse of major economies, or minimize the collapse. Okay, and then you've got a longer term process, which sometimes is decline. I think Argentina is a very good model, not only for its more recent years of political chaos, but 100 years of self-inflicted decline. But it didn't happen on a day. There's been a succession of Argentinian crises that lead to Argentina no longer being one of the better off GNP per head countries in the world. It once was, now it isn't. And Turkey might go in that direction, except I would then put a question mark. It does have a high growth rate, had a high growth rate for most of the Erdogan years, better than most other countries. So maybe it's not decline, it's just chaos, you know, the occasional chaos. It has chaos, someone comes and rescues it, enough to stop complete collapse, and then it continues for another 15 years until the next chaos. So I'm not even sure that this punctuated chaotic situation in Turkey necessarily is decline. It was for Argentina, by the way. I think it might be for the UK, but not necessarily for Turkey. So I think this is a kind of interesting question. What does it mean for a big country's economy to collapse? And I sort of don't have a very clear answer to that question. And Turkey's a nice case study around which to think about that question.
So Argentina is not a great power, the football pitch.
It's not even that anymore. I mean, you know, yeah, but then we've never.
As of yesterday, Sinan.
Yeah. One of the things that we talked about, I think the days of, let's say, if you take the early 90s into account, you know, with the fall of the Soviet Union and whatnot, you know, the economy was the linchpin of overseeing, I would argue, a lot of political change, right? So, you know, the Chinese learned basically that protests such as Tiananmen Square don't necessarily have to result in any major change. You just basically deal with it, and that strong sort of regime you prevent. So my big argument would be to suggest the days of, like, you know, when you could identify a government with massive economic underperformance or corruption or some combination thereof, and people rise up and hundreds of thousands of people go out in the streets and protest, and the government is forced to collapse and change. I think that's under more pressure, not least of all because of Turkey, but a lot of government experiences seem to suggest that could be an upward trend, right? The Brazilians getting extremely close. The Argentines seem to be knocking on. Hungary, what that is there. The Turks, yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if it's definitive, but I think that my biggest point I would make is
it's not as easy as public pressure building up to remove a useless government from power. I think those days are long gone. You need something more. I mean, I remember all corruption. Erdogan was faced with what I consider to be catastrophic revelations back in 2012, 2013, when the Gulenist sort of judiciary that he empowered after falling out with Erdogan started to expose and disclose the most damning evidence of his and his family's and the highest echelons of the AKP's corruption by wiretaps and telephone conversations and documents just detailing all this high level of corruption that could just topple any government in a country which has a reasonable amount of rule of law. We thought that Erdogan was done until he just replaced the judiciary. He just replaced the people and basically overhauled law enforcement. And so I think we're up against a unique challenge for our time, which is how do you deal with the notion that public pressure is not enough to dismiss people at the ballot box? I don't know. I don't really have an insight into that, but it's a challenge about it.
Great, thank you so much. Just to make an announcement. Next term, we continue the conversation. Galip Balay will be talking about Russia and Turkey. Galip is a dear friend and dear student here at St. Anthony's. The other announcement is that we have more sandwiches. So there is no austerity yet. But please join me in offering an applause to Bill and
Yeah.